This is Conejo Attack speaking on September 30th. Nothing really relevant has happened since the last video, and I thought this one would be easy to make, but it turns out I was wrong. Why, we finally reached the end of Arc 1, and with that, it's time to cover all the side stories that happen alongside this part of the main plot, and really heading reach the arc.
But let's speed this up with AI. Unless you're a maniac like me, I highly doubt you've ever even heard of the side stories I'm about to talk about. And since there are so many of them, I had to add a whole new section to today's video. So yeah, let's pick up the pace. Before we go on, a quick thank you to everyone who supports the channel through memberships. This time, special thanks to Igna, who just subscribed to the highest tier. I'm not sure if you're the same Igna who already bought a membership a few days ago, but if you are, and you're supporting me from 2 separate accounts, thank you so much. Not many people go that far as to pay for memberships from 2 different accounts. Also, thanks to those supporting through the English membership, and a warm welcome to the new members. KYCP and Abdul Malik Abdul Muiz. Welcome to Cut Content from Season 1, Episode 3. We pick up where we left off, with Amelia arriving at Ram's loot house. Subaru is surprised to see her there and realizes that Amelia always shows up faster whenever he doesn't help her. Of course, he doesn't know why, but as I mentioned earlier, the reason she got there quicker this time compared to the first loop is because Subaru kept Felt busy, which stopped her from hiring thugs to slow Amelia down. Before moving on, I wanted to bring up something. While watching Ram get ready to fight Elsa, I remembered a controversy that popped up recently about his strength. People complained after it was revealed that Ram fought and nearly defeated Aldebaran, saying things like, why didn't he put up that kind of fight against Elsa? Honestly, this whole debate worries me because it just shows how much people struggle with reading comprehension. Against Aldebaran, Ram was more of a strategist than a fighter, and he had plenty of time to prepare against the traitor. But against Elsa, he didn't know a thing until Felt showed up with Subaru. Anyway, back to the point. When Amelia threatens to attack everyone, Subaru tries to mediate and calm things down as quickly as possible. He makes a signal to Ram to try and persuade Felt, but Ram misinterprets it and thinks Subaru is telling him to attack Amelia. So, of course, he refuses. Later, when Subaru gives his speech to defend Felt, there's a moment where he breaks the fourth wall and talks directly to the viewers, telling us to pay attention. Honestly, I found it a bit bland, but nothing too big. A cool little detail that sadly got left out, and now has to be inferred, is that Elsa's cloak can actually absorb the impact of magic spells. That's why there's a scene where her cloak vanishes right after taking a hit from an enemy spell. Subaru even jokes that now that she's stripped down, the Bowel Hunter is probably faster as a Dragon Ball reference. But Elsa shuts him down, saying the cloak barely weighed a few pounds. During Amelia and Puck's fight against Elsa, Ram explains why spirit users are so hard to deal with. Fighting them is basically like fighting 2 people at once. Usually one attacks while the other looks for an opening to finish you off. In fact, if Puck hadn't disappeared right then, Elsa probably would have lost quickly. When Puck disappears, Ram decides to jump in. In the anime, he just goes in without hesitation. But in the novel, Subaru actually tries to stop him because he knows what's going to happen, but he can't get the words out. Another interesting anime-only detail is that when Ram is defeated, Subaru actually starts planning to reset the loop, but gives up once he realizes he doesn't want to go through all that pain again. I think this flew under the radar back then, because in Season 1, a lot of people were constantly yelling for Subaru to just redo things. They seem to have forgotten that Subaru didn't choose that option because he didn't want to feel the pain again. While it's clear in the anime that Elsa is way stronger than Subaru physically, the gap is even bigger in the novel. Amelia's help made the difference less obvious. Eventually, Subaru gets a little plot armor in the form of adrenaline, which gives him the strength to kick a table and knock it into Elsa's knife as it was about to stab Felt. Of course, this leaves his foot throbbing in pain right after. The fight sequence between Amelia, Subaru, and Elsa is almost entirely faithful, except for the ending. Subaru's final attack comes when he kicks Elsa with all his strength. In the anime, he drops Ram's club to do it, but in the novel, he's still holding it up the whole time. Personally, I find the anime version way more believable since Subaru was already injured by then, and the idea that he'd still be carrying the club during his final attack feels weird. Maybe Tappei realized that too, and that's why he had the anime change it. Another neat addition in the anime was the scene of Felt running desperately for help. This does happen in the novel, but the anime added the detail that people completely ignored her and left her on her own. That's the reason Felt hates living in the slums. She feels the people there have completely given up on their situation and don't even try to change it. The fact that they just hide in their homes only reinforces her point. Before getting to the most interesting piece of lore in this episode, I want to add one more thing. Subaru narrates that when he saw Elsa fighting Reinhard, he realized she had been holding back when she fought him and Emilia. The cuts she made with her knife were completely different in force compared to when she was up against Subaru. Now, let's talk about something that genuinely surprised me. This isn't actually cut content, because what I'm about to tell you is something that was only revealed a couple of years ago in the novels. Believe it or not, Tappei later released some lore that expanded on the characters from this episode, but it wasn't about Subaru, Reinhard, or Elsa. None of them. Instead, the lore was about the dumb little sword Reinhard used here. That's right. Nearly 13 years after the novel chapter where this all happened was published, Tappei decided to add lore to the sword from episode 3 of the anime. The lore itself isn't anything groundbreaking, but what is amazing is that just like Reinhard was able to draw out the full potential of a random sword, in the future, Cecilis Segment, the guy often said to be the strongest after Reinhard, would do something similar with a dagger Aldebaran gave him. To illustrate this parallel, the author wrote the following.
In the past, there was a building known as the Loot House in the slums of the royal capital of Lugunica, the symbol of the kingdom's long-standing debt, a place shrouded in darkness where stolen goods were openly traded, had laid. This loot house became the stage for a confrontation over a crucial item that could determine the fate of the kingdom, ultimately meeting its demise in the clash involving the current Sword Saint, Reinhard van Astrea, who intervened to defeat the Bowel Hunter, Elsa Grunhirt, resulting in its collapse. The sword Reinhard had wielded at that moment was a nameless, mass-produced blade. It did not possess any extraordinary sharpness. It was merely a sword borrowed by Reinhard that happened to be in the loot house and used for the battle. However, with that single swing in the hands of the Sword Saint Reinhard, it gained the opportunity to unleash a sword strike that even the most famous and treasured swords would never experience. Of course, no ordinary sword could withstand that single slash, and it instantly crumbled in Reinhard's hands, ending its life as a tangible object there. However, was the broken sword truly unfortunate? It was impossible for one to fathom the feelings of a tool, but between a sword gathering dust in a corner of the loot house, rusting away for decades before being discarded, or fulfilling its purpose as a tool, which could be said to have better fulfilled its true purpose, one could say that the sword fulfilled in a single swing what it might have taken 1,000 or even 10,000 swings in the hands of an ordinary wielder to achieve. The story has begun to veer off its main point, so we shall get it back on track. Simply put, the reason for the collapse of the loot house was that an ordinary blunt blade had found a wielder who could fulfill its true purpose as a sword, and thus had it been swung. If that was the case, then, if the Sword Saint could achieve that, there was no reason why an equally skilled wielder could not do the same.
At this point in the story, Cecilis Segmund, with the help of Aldebaran's dagger, ends up defeating one of the generals of the resurrected Echidna. But let's get back to Season 1. It's revealed that Subaru also works out because he never wants to end up fat and bald in his life. He even calls Ram bald, which makes the old man mad. And in pain, Ram groans and tells him not to call him that. By this time, Emilia had already used up her mana healing Ram, so she was exhausted and couldn't move. Subaru then had the bad luck of being caught right when Reinhard's final attack landed, and he suffered a lot trying to shield his allies' bodies from the falling debris. When things finally settled down, Subaru begs Emilia to show Felt some mercy. In the anime, this part was simply skipped. But what's more interesting, and this is just my personal opinion, I've always had two problems with what happens around this moment. The first is that it always felt strange to me that Reinhard couldn't stop Elsa's surprise attack against the protagonists. Believe it or not, I actually think the anime handled this part better. In the novel, it's made clear there were a few seconds of distance before Elsa reached her target, while in the anime, they placed her much closer when she launched her strike. I imagine Tappei realized he had made Reinhard look too slow here and tried to fix it in the adaptation. Personally, I can't really buy this part in the novel anymore because in recent volumes we see Reinhard being insanely fast. Looking back at this now feels disappointing, so for me, I take the anime version as canon, not the novels. The second thing that always bugged me was how Reinhard just let Elsa escape and didn't chase her. But that changed after rereading this scene. You see, at this point in the story, Reinhard already knew about Emilia's position as a potential royal candidate. That's why, once Elsa left, the knight chose to prioritize the candidate's safety instead of capturing the assassin. He even offered to personally escort Emilia with other knights to ensure she got to her destination safely. I'd love to give you more details about Emilia and Reinhard's very first meeting, but that comes from a novel that was only released recently and hasn't been translated yet. I'll cover it once I can get my hands on it, but for now, it'll have to wait. One detail that would have been great to keep is the part where Reinhard feels guilty for how the situation spiraled out of control, and he asks Emilia to punish him for his incompetence. Emilia just tells him she doesn't understand why he keeps self-flagellating when, in reality, he did a great job. She even suggests he'd be better off asking for a reward, just like Subaru, who asked for the candidate's name as his prize. I know it sounds silly, but it's the kind of silliness that works perfectly coming from Emilia. It's a shame this wasn't adapted. Another little detail about Emilia that didn't make it in was a moment where she starts to suspect something. Something that, as it turns out later, was actually true. But I'll save that for the end, since it's a pretty interesting curiosity. Another cut line is Reinhard explaining why he was even in the area. He had decided on his own to help Subaru with his search, and while wandering around, he ran into Felt. A short line from Emilia was also dropped, where she asks Felt to give up stealing in exchange for her forgiveness. Felt bluntly tells her that unless Emilia can guarantee her food and shelter, she can't promise that. Since that's not realistic, Felt says she has no choice but to keep stealing just to survive. Honestly, I liked that touch, because it serves as a reminder to the half-elf that not everything can be solved as easily as she'd like. Even the technique Reinhard uses to put Felt to sleep was toned down. Emilia explains that this method can cause lasting damage to Felt's mana gate. That really surprised me, because it shows how serious the situation was for Reinhard to resort to something his pacifist side normally wouldn't. Anyway, now it's time for the most interesting detail from this section. When Emilia wonders how strange it is for a total stranger to show up right when she needed help and even risk his life for her, she suspects Roswaal might have had something to do with it. This annoys her so much she outright calls the Margrave a weirdo. It's funny because she says it so casually here, but later on we see that Emilia is terrible at insulting people. So this scene leaves two options. Either Emilia was genuinely bitter here and just let it slip, or Taipei decided to tweak that side of her character after this point in the story. Later in Season 2, we'd find out Emilia's suspicions about Roswaal were correct. And what's even more interesting is that this exact tactic of letting someone help you after something valuable is stolen, so you naturally start trusting them, was something that had once been used against Roswaal. In the past, Russell Fellow stole something from him and pretended to help him recover it as a way to regain his trust. Of course, Roswaal saw through it instantly, but he admitted it was a brilliant strategy. He even wondered if he'd ever use it for himself. Then, nearly 15 years later, he would end up using this same trick to secure Subaru's cooperation in his faction. But enough of that. For now, let's move on to this episode's tweets. As for the tweets I gathered, there were some interesting ones, though I have to admit it took me longer than usual to collect all this info. Anyway, details. The author mentioned that when he was a kid, he had a bamboo sword like the one Rom uses to fight against Elsa, so I guess that's where the inspiration came from? Then he comments that he really liked how Reinhard's divine protection that lets him dodge things was shown in the anime. We see this when Elsa throws one of her knives at Reinhard, and without doing anything, he avoids the hit thanks to that divine protection. In another tweet, he reveals that the reason Reinhard entered the fight from the roof was because, right after telling Felt he'd help her with her problem, the Sword Saint jumped straight from where he was to the scene. Then, in another tweet, for some reason he made a pretty lame joke shipping Felt and Rom. The author also says that while episodes 1 and 2 were well made, the production team put much more effort into episode 3 because of the action sequences throughout the entire chapter. In case you're wondering, back then the character designer was Kyuta Sakai. She's the one who drew the sketches that the animators later used. Unfortunately, she would step down after Season 2. According to Taipei, she had a soft spot for Felt, so he says she put a lot of effort into making sure the candidate looked really good in her appearances during this part of the story. Another interesting fact is that the scene where Subaru asks for Emilia's name as his reward was actually very hard to pull off. It took about 10 tries before they settled on the final version. Finally, and this was something I didn't even know myself, it turns out that back then the people following the novel were super hyped about Rem's first appearance. The author himself hints at this with a tweet from that time, saying that a character fans had been eagerly waiting for would soon show up. I remember that in those days, people used to say the author put Rem to sleep because she was overshadowing Emilia. But that's not accurate at all. That would only make sense if the anime had been a completely separate production from the novel, but in reality it was based directly on it. And the whole plotline of Rem being put to sleep had already been written 2 or 3 years earlier in the novel. But anyway, let's move on to the last section of today's episode. This week's break time wasn't all that exciting. It only talked about the divine protections Reinhard has, and even spoiled the one that lets him resurrect, a protection he won't actually use for the first time until Season 3. There were a couple of cute little interactions between Puck and his daughter, but by far the most interesting part was that it finally answered a question many people had back then. Remember when Subaru warns Puck about Elsa's attack? That moment felt strange to Emilia and Puck, since Subaru wasn't supposed to know about the spirit's existence. In this break time, they discuss it, and in the end, they simply conclude that, thanks to Subaru's achievements, they'll give him the chance to prove he isn't a threat to Emilia. But let's move on with the video's next sections. This is a section that will only show up in the final episodes of each arc. Arc 1 goes from episode 1 up until Subaru saves Emilia in the final loop, so all the stories I'll briefly mention here are side stories that happened parallel to the events of Arc 1. Obviously, I'm not going to narrate them in full detail, but I'll give you the general idea of what each one is about, and if you're interested, I invite you to go read them yourself. We'll start with the story that tells us what Emilia was doing just before meeting Felt. It explains how she got separated from Ram, and ended up helping a little cat girl who couldn't pay for an item she had eaten. That girl was Mimi. The half-elf tried to pay for her, but realized she had lost her purse. With Puck's help, they put on a little magic show, and due to a misunderstanding, the crowd panicked and ran away. Once everyone had dispersed, Emilia managed to find her purse and pay Mimi's bill. The girl thanked her, saying she'd never forget it. So yes, folks, the very first meeting between Emilia and Mimi didn't happen in Season 3. It actually happened before Episode 1. Then there's another side story that tells what was going on at the same time, but from Felt's perspective. It narrates how, while Emilia was dealing with Mimi, Felt was already keeping an eye on her since she had been tasked with stealing the insignia. At one point, Felt sees a shady man bump into Emilia and steal her purse. This worried her since she thought the object she was supposed to steal might be inside. So she decided to chase the thief down. When she caught up to him, Wilhelm had already appeared and forced the thief to return what he had stolen. Felix then showed up and urged the old man to hurry, so Wilhelm asked Felt to return the purse to its owner. Felt went back to where Emilia was, and taking advantage of the commotion Puck caused with his magic, she quietly dropped the purse next to Emilia, linking this story directly with Emilia's side story. A few minutes later, she would go on to steal the insignia. There's also another side story showing what Ram was doing at the time. It says she was searching for Emilia but couldn't find her. On her way, she ran into Aldebaran, who acted like he knew her and even called her by name, despite the fact that Ram had never told him. After they parted ways, she was intercepted by the thugs from Episode 1. The servant had no trouble defeating them, and right after, she noticed a huge light coming from the slums. That was Reinhard's final attack. She figured Emilia must be there. When she arrived, she found Emilia healing a black-haired boy. To wrap up this collection of side stories, there's also one that shows Emilia's point of view during the successful loop. It tells how she managed to calm the little girl down without Subaru's help, and how she too was intercepted by the thugs before reaching Felt. Those would be all the side stories tied to Arc 1, but there are a couple more that don't take place here, though they're still fun reads. One shows what Felt's everyday life as a thief looked like, and another is exclusive to the very first loop, the one where Subaru and Emilia died together. That one narrates the whole thing from Emilia's perspective. Honestly, these last two side stories are the least interesting, but hey, I'm just doing my job of bringing the info. So that's it for today. As you noticed, this video took longer than usual, and that's because I've got someone helping me edit the upcoming episodes of this series. I've been working on scripts for other chapters to pass on to my assistant so he can edit another episode in parallel with the ones I'm doing myself. That means it'll take me a bit longer to bring you the next video, but the trade-off is that after that, the episodes will come out faster. And to finish, what did you think of the side stories?